this is definitely not a video I ever thought I'd be making. Not because I don't like Breaking Bad or because I didn't think that it was worthy of getting a standalone video. Far from it. In fact, I absolutely love Breaking Bad. I've been watching it on and off for about a year now. I've mentioned it in passing before on some of my previous videos, but I've never gotten a chance to talk about the series from front to back in its own dedicated way like this until I finally finished it just yesterday, and I have some thoughts on it. Some you might agree with, some you might not. But what I want to stress right from the start here is that this is not going to be a play-by-play, full plot analysis and character breakdown like so many others on YouTube have already done. Partially because of the oversaturation of that style of review, but also because it's not really what I'm interested in talking about. If you are looking for something like that, might I recommend either Mike's video on Mike's Talks and Thoughts or James Rolfe of Cinemassacre's review of Breaking Bad, both linked in the description and both worth a watch anyway, but they definitely take a much different approach than I'm going to for this video. Instead, I want to focus in on a discussion that I think was really blossomed after I finished Breaking Bad, and the thing that I took away from it the most. The discussion of importance of consistency in a TV show, but also how that is compared to its peak quality. Breaking Bad is by no means a stranger to acclaim. It is, in fact, the most acclaimed series of all time, according to Guinness Book World Records. And just looking online, just typing in Breaking Bad on Google, will definitely confirm that for you very quickly. The interesting thing about this series, it's always kind of been a bit of a white whale for me, because I've heard for so long that this show was outstanding, that it was a must-watch, but the other half of the coin paints a very different picture. Criticism in general nowadays is very black and white, and I don't think it's that unpopular for me to say that this might be the most polarizing show that we've ever really talked about on the channel, and it might just be the most polarizing show ever made, in the sense that there are a lot of people, and I mean a lot of people, probably way more than you think that this show is absolute trash and is totally overhyped and isn't worth a minute of your time. Now that compared to, of course, the oceans and oceans of acclaim and praise that this show has gotten, is a very difficult one to have a nuanced conversation about. Anyone that's tried to do it in the past pretty much has planted their flag in one of those two camps. It's very rare that you see someone have a very nuanced opinion on the show that isn't just, oh yeah, it's fucking awesome, oh, or yeah, it fucking sucks. Personally speaking, I don't think it's a perfect show, but I like it a lot. Is it something that would rank above a Walking Dead or an SVU or even a Chicago PD? Probably not. If I had to give it a score, just like boil it down to a number, probably around a 9 to a 9.5. It is very close to breaking into that top three, but I don't think it would top any of these for very different reasons that I don't think any of these necessarily are perfect shows either. And that's what leads me to the main discussion that I want to have as far as the takeaway I found with Breaking Bad. I'm going to use this as an analogy to compare to one of my other favorite things to talk about here on the channel, which is music. So bear with me for a minute as I paint this picture. Breaking Bad is the equivalent to a band like Guns N' Roses. Guns N' Roses fucking rocks, and they are not overrated, but it wouldn't be that hard to find people that think they are. Part of the reason why that is because a lot of their success rests on one album, Appetite for Destruction. Personally speaking, I think that this album is a top 5 rock record of all time. I think it's one of the best debuts of all time, easily in the hard rock genre. It stands as a clear winner. Comparing that, though, the rest of Guns N' Roses' catalog, while really good, never quite hit the same level as an Appetite for Destruction. Some of the albums, in fact, like A Chinese Democracy, have a very, very low floor in comparison. A show like Chicago PD, on the other hand, is more equated to a band like Paramore. Paramore is also very popular within more of a niche category, admittedly, but they have a much more consistent output. I don't think it's that hard to find Paramore defenders that would argue that their consistency as far as all 5 of their albums definitely are above Guns N' Roses' consistency. The difference, though, is that they've never made an album either to the same heights as Appetite for Destruction. What I'm getting at is that Breaking Bad, being Guns N' Roses in this analogy, has episodes like Ozymandias and Grilled and Crawl Space and Face Off that are the Appetite for Destructions of TV. Simply put, the best of the best. Chicago PD has great episodes too, like a Stillwater, for example, that might be their equivalent to a Paramore album like Riot, which is considered their best, but it's never quite hit the same level. They also just don't have the same mainstream appeal as a band like Guns N' Roses, the same way that PD doesn't have the mainstream popularity of a Breaking Bad. But the floor that Paramore or Chicago PD have are way above where the floor of Breaking Bad or Guns N' Roses is at. When you take a look at a weaker episode of Chicago PD, it still has plenty of action, it still has plenty of great chemistry within the cast, and there's a lot of nuance that can be built off of that. When you look at an episode like Fly, for example, of Breaking Bad, which is often considered the worst of the series, there's a lot more polarization there. It's extremely difficult to have a nuanced conversation about an episode like Fly the same way that it might be with a weaker episode of Chicago PD. And part of the reason is because it's so much different than anything else that Breaking Bad would ever do before or after it aired. Personally speaking, I love this episode. That might be a hot take in and of itself, but I really love the episode Fly. It's actually one that I've seen the most of any of them. I've already rewatched it since I finished the series. And I think the conversation that they have in this episode is probably the best that they ever did throughout the entire run of the show. All this is to say that while Chicago PD might be more consistent, Breaking Bad, I still feel like most people would have as a better show overall. And I think the reason why that is because of the fact that their peak quality is just so much better. It's really hard to put this all into words unless you have kind of seen everything that I'm referring to here, but the best way I can say it is the stuff that is really good in Breaking Bad will stick with you a lot longer than the stuff that's really good from PD. But the stuff that really is bad from Breaking Bad, whether it's an episode like Fly or maybe a character or two that you're just not a fan of at all, you will also feel much more passionate against those things than you would that anything is really bad on Chicago PD. And this is where I turn it to you in saying, do you think that peak quality is more important than consistency? Because looking at it in that perspective, I don't necessarily think that most people would argue that. But when you kind of lay it out analytically like that, you start to turn some heads. The interesting thing also is that you might be thinking this is very subjective, but when you take a look at the statistics of it, it also kind of points in the direction that, again, Breaking Bad isn't as consistent as you might assume. When you take a look at the IMDb score between what the highest rated episode is and the lowest rated episode, the score that you get in between those, the gap in score, is 2.2 for Breaking Bad. On Chicago PD, the gap is only 1.6. Again, never reaching the same heights as Breaking Bad, but keeping a tighter, more consistent quality. What I think is very telling, though, about that is the peak quality episodes that you most associate with the series are often the big, heavy, action-packed moments. A show like Ozymandias or Face Off, for example, where there's a lot of tension, there's a lot of big, heavy-set moments of people dying. Those are going to be the ones that stick with you. But I think what people often forget about, and the thing that really sold me on the show, and honestly, the thing that I like most from it, even above those action moments, is the quieter, more intimate dialogue and conversations that a lot of these characters can carry, even if there isn't a gun in sight. One of the most defining moments from season 1 wasn't the killing of Crazy 8 or something like that. It was just a very simple scene with Walt, Skyler, Marie, and Hank talking about Walt's cancer diagnosis. And with that very bare bones, very simple premise, you didn't think that there was going to be much to take away from this scene. But because the acting is so good here and because the dialogue is so well written from all these talented people on the crew, this scene is one of the most memorable in my eyes. And it's really one of the defining moments in the start to becoming Heisenberg. The character development with Walt here isn't necessarily made solely through those more intense action scenes. It's very much a slow burn for these very intimate, quieter moments that slowly but surely add up to him becoming who he is in that final scene. And that's really the most telling thing about a show like Breaking Bad in comparison to anything else. Chicago PD or SVU or pretty much any other example of a procedural is going to have action moments in every episode, but they're also going to have quiet moments in every episode too. It's just a formula that gets repeated because it works and because that's what the audience has come to expect. But with a show like Breaking Bad, the consistency is sacrificed in favor of doing things that you might not expect. You don't necessarily know it's coming next episode to next episode, and it always keeps you on your toes. That's why when it hits, it definitely hits and is super memorable. But when it doesn't, it sticks out like a sore thumb. And that's how you get the big distinction gap between Ozymandias and Fly and how the audience perceived those things throughout the context of the series. Now, it wouldn't necessarily be a TV video here on the NVG Nick channel, and especially a review of a show like Breaking Bad, without me being a little bit of a contrarian and talking about some unpopular opinions I have with the series. So before we end here, let's talk about 10 unpopular opinions I have. Some of these you might agree with, some of these you might not, and we'll do it rapid fire style. Jane is a much better partner and had a more interesting relationship with Jesse than Andrea did. I think the Andrea-Brock storyline got a little overbearing after a while, and even though it definitely was more intense, it just wasn't as interesting to watch play out the same way that Jane's was, and I wish we got to see a little bit more of Jane and Jesse together in the series. Hank overall is kind of a dick. Even though he is pretty fun to watch, and I think Dean Norris did a really good job with the role, his ego and his pride definitely got in the way of some of his more honorable traits, and especially early in the series, he had sort of a racist undertone to his character as well, which was definitely a big turnoff. I think by the end, he just kind of came off as kind of a blowhard, and you kind of rooted against him towards the end of the series. Marie is without a doubt the worst character on the show. He's worse than Ted in pretty much every way. Aside from the fact that she is a better wife to Hank versus the way that Skyler is a wife to Walter. I think that she is more compassionate, more loving, especially considering all the stuff that Hank goes through in the series. And I would argue that as a whole, that was easily her best traits, and I think is the only salvaging part to her character. Segueing into the next one, I think that Skyler is a much better character than people give her credit for. Even though she's not as loyal, obviously, or as good to Walt as Marie is to Hank, I think that just overall she's more entertaining to watch. And I think that Anna Gunn is honestly in the top 3 best actors or actresses on the show. Pretty much every scene that she does, if you're rooting for or against her character, she fucking nails every single line. Saul, I think, is overall the best character on the show. I'd put him above Mike, above Walt, above Jesse. Definitely the comic relief certainly helps, but I think Bob Odenkirk in general just has such a bright personality behind him, and it's definitely clear that he was the one to get the spin-off series above anybody else. Speaking of Saul and his crew, I think that QB might be better than Huel? I mean, it's not definitive by any means, but damn, is Bill Burr really good in this role. Huel is obviously a legend, and pretty much every one of his scenes is super iconic, but I really like the way that QB is able to just like distract people when they're doing a heist or when they need something done, you know? He's just really good at just, coming off very convincing that way. It's very fun to watch. When you talk about the villains on the show, Todd and Lydia are easily the worst two. They just flat out annoyed me. The whole Walter Jr. loves breakfast thing is really unjustified. Like, I think there's maybe like 3 or 4 times in the whole series where he's like really adamant about breakfast. I guess it's more prevalent in the first season, but like by the end of it, he like barely mentions it. So why it became as big as it is, I'm not sure. And finally, the 10th and probably most unpopular of all these opinions that I have about the series is that Breaking Bad is fantastic, totally worth a watch, but it's still just a little bit overrated. Is it in the top 5 dramas? Maybe just barely, but it's definitely not the best. And everyone that says it sucks ass hasn't seen through the show with the right perspective. Thanks for watching, everybody. Hopefully you guys did enjoy this overview of Breaking Bad here on the channel. If you did, definitely consider subscribing and commenting below your thoughts on the show, or if you want to talk about that interesting debate between consistency and peak quality. I would love to hear what you have to say on that for sure. Other than that, have a great rest of your day. Take care.